Michelangelo was a sculptor, right? Michelangelo was a sculptor. The previous slide had some images of it. It's still loading here, so it's not letting me go back. And he was called to Rome because Pope Julius II decided that he wanted a tomb created for him in his own lifetime. Remember that Julius II was one of the most powerful people on the planet in the 1500s. And so Michelangelo was really known for his powerful sculptures. So we didn't really get a chance to talk about David very much, but David was extraordinary. David was larger than life rather than life size, colossal nude. He's like 13 feet tall. This piece of marble that he used sat around forever, and other sculptors tried to carve it and never did. And so it was kind of intimidating. And so Michelangelo was able to achieve this really memorable piece. And it was a symbol of Florence, just like Donatello's David. So these two sculptures have a sense of power to them. And in art history, we often call it terrablita. It's something that's used for Michelangelo, and it's kind of this active but calm at the same time. Both of them have kind of this stern expression. They're kind of looking in the horizon, but they have like engaged muscles. So they're in relaxed poses, but very much like Hellenistic, it's like you see all the muscles. They look like they're all flexed at the same time. And that's one of those characteristics that Michelangelo is known for, and we see them in his paintings as well. Okay, so the image that we have for Michelangelo is a series of images based on the Sistine Chapel. And so there's a great video or set of videos on Khan Academy Smart History that you can look at. And so context, okay? So Michelangelo is carving this tomb, and he's carving a bunch of these sculptures, and he's planning the architecture because he was an architect as well. And Julius basically says, I know that you're trained in fresco. I would like you to paint the interior of the Sistine Chapel. And so from an aerial view right here, you can see that the Sistine Chapel, this small chapel that's connected to St. Peter's Cathedral. So this is St. Peter's, and remember that this is being rebuilt at this time. So we're in Vatican City. And the dimensions of this is the one that you have on the left. It's not very Renaissance-like on the exterior. It's very bland, it's very boring because you can't really see it. You can see here in the courtyard that Bernini creates in the Baroque period that really the size and the scale of St. Peter's is just so enormous, you can't see through it. You know, these are the papal apartments. So, you know, where School of Athens is, all of this is over here. This is all where the Pope lives. And so connected to the Pope's residence and kind of connected to St. Peter's and all these other elements of the Vatican is this really kind of modest chapel. And so it looks kind of fortress-like, it looks kind of Gothic from the exterior. And so he says, you know, Julius says, I want you to repaint the ceiling. The ceiling looks like the interior of Giotto's Arena Chapel. So the Scrivini Chapel, it had a bunch of stars and it was blue. It was pretty typical. It would look like a night sky. And so he decided, Julius, I want the ceiling painted. So all the walls were covered in frescoes that were done by early Renaissance painters like Ghirlandaio and Botticelli. And so the image that we have is the entire ceiling, right? And then we also will talk about the Last Judgment, since the image points us that way. We'll make sure that we address that as well. And then we have a close-up. So, like I said, right, Julius commissions tomb, and then he does this. So this is an interactive website that you can go to if you want to see each of these panels close up. So thinking about the content of that ceiling, in the center row, we have stories of Genesis. So the imagery in the center, which is what is kind of best known, is only images from the first book of the Old Testament. There are absolutely positively no images of Jesus whatsoever in the ceiling. There is nothing. Okay? The whole basis of Christianity, there's no images of him there. Okay? On the outside rows, so right here, can you guys see my cursor, right? Outside rows, so outside of the center, there is prophets and sibyls. So they're Old Testament prophets that are men, and then they're Greek sibyls. In the corners, we have poignant Old Testament stories. So they're in these triangular kind of pendentive shapes. Can you guys see those pendentives on the corners? Then we have these little triangles, right, that connect this ceiling to the walls, and those are family images of Jesus and the ancestors of Jesus. So the arches and the triangles are all like ancestry. So Mary has a lineage to David, an Old Testament king and writer of Psalms. And so there's a bunch of different elements of his ancestry. But like I said, there's no pictures of him whatsoever on the ceiling. There is on the Last Judgment on the wall. Okay, so here we have all of those different ones. I don't think you need to know, obviously, all these little images and what it is exactly. But we'll focus on the things I think are probably most important for you to know, okay? So there is a set, right, on the end that he created first, and the one that we have in R250, that's a close-up, is one of the very first images he painted. I think it's very surprising because these are probably the least known. You guys all know creation of man. You all know the fingers touching of God and Adam, and they don't put it in the 250. They put something else, okay? So, great, wonderful. Animation didn't work this morning. So the story is of the flood, okay? So the content of this is the flood. So you should be on your close-up image of this one. And so in this, it is the story of the ark, right? And this is what that is right back here. This building-like thing kind of floating in the water is the ark. And then basically we have the people who are basically being flooded out. So in the Old Testament, God got really upset that man wasn't following his law, and he decided to wipe out the whole world with a great flood. So Noah was saved with his family, and Noah had to collect 2 animals, male and female of each animal, and store it on the ark so they could start over. So it's actually kind of funny because these are some of the last stories of Genesis. And those last stories are the stories that Michelangelo started with. So it's not like, on the first day God created. Those are the last images that he actually made. Okay, so how does he organize space? Thinking about Leonardo, thinking about Raphael, how do they organize all these people? Can you guys turn on audio and reply, because it's going to be so much faster than chat today? What do you think? How does he organize the people?
They're in groups.
They're in groups. So these are kind of these monumental groupings that are very typical of the Renaissance. So there's a group up close, and then there's a group in like the middle ground, and then there's a group in the background. And notice that unlike Leonardo's Last Supper, where it's symmetrical and centrally focused, Michelangelo creates a dynamic composition that moves your eye, right? So your eye will travel into the background. I might first notice the cluster of people trying to survive on this little patch of land, right? So your eye moves in a circular fashion or a spiral to the right, and then gets led back through this kind of imaginary line back to the ark, right? Can you see his use of atmospheric perspective? Notice how the people in the middle ground and the background get hazier as they move into the distance, right? So these images that he did first have a lot of characters to them. There were a lot of people, okay? And he did these paintings. He did the first 3 paintings in this style, and then he did the last 6 in a style like this, right? What did he change about how he arranged and composed the compositions? How did his style change? Notice how big the figures are and how few people and background imagery there is in the creation of man that you guys are so familiar with, right? Because Michelangelo was, excuse my language, was awfully, well, I'm just going to clean up. He was really angry. He came to Rome to do a tomb for Julius. He did not come to paint a ceiling. He was irritated. Fresco is hard. You know, you have to redo the wet plaster every time you make a mistake. He was standing, not laying down. He was standing on scaffolding and working like this all day long. His neck hurt, his arms hurt. You know, your arms would fall asleep working on a ceiling like this, right, and painting. And then he had to deal with the attitude of Julius, telling him what to do and hitting him with sticks and all kinds of crazy things. And so when he got to the floor, he's looking up at the sky and going, all that work and I can't even see it, right? If you've ever been into the Sistine Chapel, it's hard. I used binoculars to look at the ceiling. So he's, you know, figured out after he ran away for a while, he hid from Julius. He got pulled back to Rome and he changed the style where he made the figures a lot bigger and more like, he made the stories more crystal clear. So notice how right here, can you guys see how little the figures are? And then the figures get bigger as the story goes more towards the beginning of Genesis, right? So here you can see the differences in the style from the first 2 years. You can see there's a year gap in between and then the last 2. So it took him about 4 years to paint the whole thing. Right? So these are those characteristics. Many of them we've already mentioned, right? So remember that the compositions and the figures are really dynamic in the High Renaissance, and there still is an emphasis on perspective, modeling, and anatomy. With perspective, right? As we see the whole ceiling, he uses a lot of perspective to create this faux architectural elements. So all of these paintings have frames and borders around them. That's all painted. That's all trompe l'oeil, an illusion. Just like Raphael did at the School of Athens, right? So in the middle, that's where we have the creation, right? The images that we see on the ceiling, as well as the Last Judgment, were inspired by Hellenistic sculpture. Right? The Vatican has a wonderful collection of Hellenistic and classical sculpture. Laocoon is there. This Hercules image is there. Farnese is in the Farnese Palace in Rome, right? And so Michelangelo knew of this style and he used it in the style of his figures, right? So this is his rendition of the leaving of Eden, and you can see this is Masaccio on the left, and you can see how he paid homage to Masaccio on his version of it, right? And so on the images of the prophets and Sibyls, there's these beautiful images of women, and we really kind of see those basic styles of these women in the images. And he typically practiced drawing them in sketches, and he would sketch them in nude so that he got a real understanding of their anatomy and the modeling before he actually painted it, right? So on the Delphic Sybil that you guys have, This is not that one. We'll go to it a little bit. You might want to write down some of the basic characteristics of Michelangelo. You could do this in just the general Sistine Chapel ones as well. His color was luminous. Before it was cleaned, a lot of people said that his colors were muddy and ugly, and he wasn't a very good colorist. But once they cleaned it, they found that the colors were really beautiful, light and bright. He used a lot of soft modeling. He had sculpted bodies with Hellenistic qualities. Michelangelo was a homosexual, and so he tended to use male models even for female figures. And so his female Sibyls have very muscular, sort of masculine qualities to them. The figures tend to be very idealized rather than realistic. So they're very perfected. He often uses a limited background. He doesn't get all caught up in too much visual information defining the setting. Like his sculptures, his poses are very active and dramatic. He has a lot of complex arrangements. So even though he might not have a lot of background, he's got the architectural elements, he's got the sculptural details, he's got all those panels, and so he's organizing very complex visual information. And then his figures are larger than life, right? His figures are going to be larger than life. So the elements of trompe-l'oeil, all of this stuff that looks like architecture is fake. All of these sculptures that look like they are 3D are fake. These medallions that look like they're in copper or bronze are fake, right? These little classical figures, these male figures here in the four corners, are called ignudi, and they're just these little male nudes that are in between. They're kind of classically inspired. They have no Christian significance whatsoever, just something that Michelangelo decided to add. And then that grisaille technique, we talked about grisaille before. Grisaille is monochromatic painting. That helps with that illusion of the architecture and the sculpture because it's all monochrome, one color to paint it. Okay, so here is our Delphic Sybil. Does anyone know what a Sybil is? What is a Sybil? What's a Sybil? Oop, sorry, what happened? Oh, I had it. Click there. All right, a Sybil, whoop, I had the definition. Oh, there it is a female Greek prophet. Normally they were thought of as oracles, right? So you probably have heard of oracles before. Okay, and then remember that she looks kind of like a bodybuilder in a way, right? So reasons for this is that Michelangelo referenced the male body, the male nude body when he was drawing these, right? Remember that he's a sculptor, right? And so they have kind of sculptural sort of qualities to them. He was referencing the classical sculpture that he saw in the Vatican collection, as well as it was the taste of him and the patron, right? The patron, once again, is Julius II. Something to note is that Julius, right? The reason he wanted the Sistine Chapel painted in the first place is that is where the popes get their power. So that's where the popes are voted into power. That's just a chapel that clergy who live and work within the Vatican walls, that's just a personal chapel that they can use throughout the day. But it's really important when a new pope needs to be voted on. It's the room that all the cardinals show up to, and that's where they vote the new pope in. So they try to, it's kind of like the Senate or the House. They do lots of wheeling and dealing and try to put the names of a pope in. And then they burn the ballots until they figure out and they get consensus. And so smoke is black. It comes up the chimney and people wait in the courtyard looking for the chimney. And when it turns white, they put some sort of powder in. And when it comes out white, that means that they came to consensus and they figured out who the new pope would be. And then they announce it more verbally. So how is she classical? She's got contrapposto, she's got engaged muscles, she's proportional. You could probably even say she's pretty calm. I think she has a little bit of the tirabilita, a little bit of that stern sort of like expression in her face. She looks kind of annoyed, doesn't she? Ugh, I don't know why that's doing that, but okay. Here's an example of Jonah. So there's another Old Testament image, right? Here's the family of Jesus. Some of these images are before cleaning, so you can see why people thought he wasn't very good at color. So here's the cleaning process. Something I should probably tell you, which I find fascinating, is that the cleaning concoction that they often use to remove things like ash and soot, candle wax, that happens on a lot of these churches because of incense being burned and candles being burned for centuries, is they use basically something that's an equivalent to saliva. Because you know your saliva in your mouth breaks down particles, organic materials. They basically make, like people literally do use their own saliva sometimes when they clean a painting, but they have a concoction that basically has the same chemical makeup as saliva to break down that so they can clean it. So you can see kind of the before and after here of one section of it. Okay, so we only have a few more minutes. The Sistine Chapel is not complete with just the ceiling. Michelangelo also paints the back wall. And so the High Renaissance is really from about 1500 to about 1527. And in 1527, we have the sack of Rome, where the Holy Roman Empire, which is different, right? Which is different, conquers the city or the Vatican City and the papal state that's within the peninsula of Italy. And so we have the Protestant Reformation happening in the time of the High Renaissance as well. So from about 1517 into the 1600s, we have a break in the church. So people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, as well as many others, rebel against the Catholic Church. So in 1517, Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses. He was Catholic, right? He was a Catholic priest, and he basically wrote about all the fallacies, all the mistakes of the church and how it was corrupt. And so he eventually was excommunicated by the church. So he criticized it for selling things like indulgences. Basically, if you pay enough, your sins would be erased. He said the Pope had no authority over purgatory, right? You can't like pay to get out of purgatory, like the Pope, someone on earth doesn't have any power over that. That Catholic doctrine about the merits of saints has no foundation in the gospel. There's nothing in the book, in the Bible, that says anything about saints and martyrs and things like that, right? And so we also have the Counter-Reformation. So a classic Catholic revival beginning with the Council of Trent in 1545. And that also ends this kind of close in the 30 Years' War. So it too continues on and on and on. And the reason to bring this up is that paintings like the Sistine Chapel back wall of the Last Judgment happen during this Counter-Reformation, trying to revive the greatness of the church. Smart History does a great job about going through the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. We don't have time for it, but feel free to indulge yourself if you're really fascinated by it, because we'll talk about it here or there as it relates to art. So this slide, you know, the effects of the Counter-Reformation and the Reformation. In the Protestant North, there's a lack of religious art being made at this time, right? If, you know, work wasn't being made for altars anymore. So we had to create a new art market. So during the Baroque, we'll see new subject matter being taken up. We have the destruction. So there's iconoclasm taking place during this time. A lot of imagery is being destroyed or painted over. Now, the Catholic Church in the Counter-Reformation starts to have large construction projects to reestablish the greatness of the Catholic Church. And they believe that art represents the core beliefs of the church. So they, had lots of extra paintings and sculptures and churches created during this Counter-Reformation. Right? So the ceiling took about 4 years to paint. The back wall was done 24 years after. So Michelangelo, after being really irritated for 4 years of painting like this, got called back to paint the back wall for Leo III. Julius is dead by now. And the altar area took 6 years to paint. So this much smaller back wall took him longer, probably because he was doing other things, but also he was a lot older as well. All right. So do you guys remember where the Last Judgment was at St. Foy? Where's the Last Judgment at St. Foy? Romanesque Church. You guys remember? It's on the doorway as you walk in, right? So it's like a reminder, this is why you're coming. And at the Scrovini Chapel or the Arena Chapel, Giotto put it on the exit. So when you're leaving, you're like, oh, I got to remember to be good when I'm on the outside. Interesting enough, Michelangelo paints his Last Judgment on the altar end. So this is the altar that we're looking towards here at the Sistine Chapel. So the only people in this chapel ever are cardinals and bishops and priests, right? So it's kind of interesting that he's reminding them about their mistakes as they're in here. So we'll have to start with this tomorrow, okay? So I will see you guys. You have 5 minutes before your next class. So